We're wrapping up the last of this series on Cultivate, and we've been looking at parables and where Jesus talks about the kingdom of God. And last week we looked at John, where he talked about being the good shepherd, and he is the gate of the sheep. And so he talked about himself, and today we're going to look at this story in Luke 15 and understand it. Some don't think I can finish this sermon in time allotted, so it's going to amaze you. How's that? The context of the story is, and we said this last week, that Jesus is experiencing increased resistance because what he's teaching, at least for the religious leaders, seems to be contrary to what they're teaching and what their understanding is. They've so boxed God in that it's harder to get to God for people, and Jesus comes and says, I came to give you life and give it to you abundantly. And in the first opening verses of chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, it says Jesus is hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, right? And so these religious leaders in the crowd start to murmur. Now, murmur means to indignantly complain as a crowd. And the reason they're complaining is because their perception is Jesus is one of the ones he's hanging out with, and we know that not to be true. He welcomes and eats with sinners with them. Are any of you Game of Thrones fans? You'll watch that series. I've read all the books, and anyway, there's a little thing in that series, and if you don't watch it, don't worry about it. But there's a custom that when you break bread and you eat salt at somebody's table, that you're responsible for the safety of that person. And in first century, there was a similar notion that there was a Hebrew idea that if you ate with somebody, you were responsible for them as long as the salt of your table was in that person. And so Jesus is eating with these sinners. There's a social implication that these religious leaders are looking at, and so they jump to these conclusions. And so there's this tension that ultimately leads to Jesus' crucifixion. And so that's kind of the context of this Luke 15 story. And so in Luke 15, Jesus tells these three different stories, these three segments of things that are lost: the sheep that are lost, the coin that are lost, and the sons that are lost. And in each one of the stories, the value increases as the stories continue. The sheep, the coins, and then the most precious thing to us are our children. And so of that which is lost, there's this increasing value and decreasing number that we see in this story. Now, I've been doing this. I went to a meeting the other day, and they said I had 41 and a half service years as a United Methodist pastor in Oklahoma. So I just calculated that that's somewhere, if I preached every Sunday, which I don't, but that was close to probably 2,000-something sermons. I don't remember ever preaching this text on Commitment Sunday. Normally when we're preaching on Commitment Sunday, we talk about what? Tithing, generosity, gratitude, right? Right? But I think this story that Jesus is telling in Luke 15 gets at the heart of what Jesus is coming to do, is to find things that are lost. And if you listen to the video today, lost in one sense is kind of a relative term. I mean, there's different degrees of lostness. Last week I told the story about going to buy a faucet and had a conversation with the clerk who, as we talked over a while, said, I need a church. I went to another place and talked to a lady about a faucet, and she asked me what I did, and we started talking about church, and she said, I have a 6.5-year-old, and my husband and I are talking about we need to go to church. And so in the testimony we saw last week, Brian Courtney, he talks about knowing of Christ, being baptized as a kid, but having no personal relationship with Christ. And so in this story of lostness, I mean, we might find ourselves somewhere along that path. And so we're going to look at this last story. And in a nutshell, this dad, who is a wealthy landowner, he has, and the reason we think he's wealthy is because he has land and property, and he has servants and slaves. And his youngest son comes to him and says, Dad, I want my inheritance. Now, normally, when do you get your inheritance? It's when you die. And so the implication is, Dad, I don't really care about you. I want what I want. And so the dad, he has an older brother, and so the dad liquidates his assets, and normally what they would do is 2/3 would go to the older son and 1/3 to the younger son. And so the younger son takes his inheritance, and he sort of squanders. He does. And this Jewish boy ends up, who's lived this kosher life, who's tried to live by those laws of the religious leaders, finds himself in a pig pen. And he's thinking, this is no place for me, for the likes of me. I wished I could eat the food I'm feeding to the pigs. And he got to thinking about home, and he starts thinking about going home, and he starts rehearsing this speech. Dad, I don't deserve to be your son. I've squandered your inheritance. Let me live in the slave quarters, and you can treat me like a hired hand. Now, in the meanwhile, the dad, as long as the son's been gone, has been making a revenge list when his son gets back of what he's going to do to him, right? Hello? No. That's not the character of the dad. The dad has been waiting and watching. I can see him standing on the porch every day looking for his son to come home. I've got several stories about that, but we took a group from New Covenant to the footsteps of Paul. We went to Greece, and we took the whole family, and so because we took the whole family, we used some frequent flyer miles for the girls to fly and join us in Athens. And so the whole group from New Covenant had gotten to the hotel in Athens, and Paul and Stephanie were dating, and Paul flew in. He joined us from Australia, and the girls didn't show up. And the girls didn't show up. And the girls didn't show up. And the longer they didn't show up, the more anxious and twisted up I got. And I remember pacing up and down the street in Athens in front of the hotel praying that God would protect our girls. We called the airlines, and finally, we got word that they had gotten into Athens, and they showed up at the hotel, and they were misdirected. We don't know what the intent was. Some people in Rome tried to take their passports, and Sarah threw a fit and said, we're not giving you our passports. They got on another flight and made it to Athens. And so, but I can still remember with emotion the feeling I had of looking for those girls. And I can imagine this dad felt that. And so Jesus tells this story. The dad sees the son coming, and he says, now, by giving this son the inheritance, he sort of disavowed him from the family, disowned him. He sees the son coming. He tells the servant, get the ring, the robe, let's plan a party, find the sandals. The son of mine who has been feeding pigs and is lost and dead is now found and alive, and we're going to have a party. The son comes up to the dad. He starts trying to tell the dad the story, and the dad says, stop, son. And the dad grabs him, and it says this, the father, filled with compassion, ran and kissed his son, threw his arms around him, welcomed him back. Now, all of us who are here, maybe if you know Christ, you felt that embrace of God. If you don't know that yet, you're in a great place, because you could experience that today, where God kisses you and pulls you in and embraces you. And normally, I've preached this before and I've ended the story there, but there's another part, isn't there? There's this issue of the older son. And the older son hears the party and the music, smells the barbecue and the spit, the food that's rotisserie on the fire, and he said, what's going on? And the servant said, this brother has come home. This brother of yours that was lost, Your dad's killed the fatted calf. And it says the older brother refused to go in because he's angry. And so when the father hears it, he goes out to the older son. He's gone to the younger son and embraced him and kissed him. Now he goes to the other son. What's that a demonstration of? The Father's what? Love, which is what we call in our faith grace, right? He's offered the younger son grace. He's offering the older son grace. And so here's the pivotal question. Why should I rejoice in God's radical welcome of prodigals? Why should we rejoice? All of our ministry, and it's a vast ministry at New Covenant, from Upward Basketball, you heard that story. I was talking to Nathan the other day in the student ministry group I'm really proud of. I said, what are y'all doing this evening? He said, we're all going as a group to Grace Living Center. We're going to play bingo with the residents. And I just thought, those folks in our student ministry, by experience, are learning about compassion, and maybe they'll catch the love of God in this. I mean, on and on and on, these stories about New Covenant, about people saying, I came here, I found God, because that which is lost is found. And that's the kind of God we have that reaches out. When Adam and Eve sinned, God walked through the garden and said, Adam, Eve, where are you? When Moses was on the backside of the Sinai, he said, Moses, I've got a job for you to do. When Moses didn't feel like he was adequate. When Saul, who was persecuting Christians, God appeared to him, changed his name because he changed his character from Saul to Paul, and said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And that's all an example of God's grace. Second reason. Did I tell you what the first reason was? We welcome prodigals because God has extended his welcome to us, if you're taking notes. Second point. We celebrate and welcome prodigals because God has extended an inheritance to us. We see this older brother. He's living in a great place with his dad. But he gets offended. Something about the return of the brother has created this drama inside of him, this bitterness. And he says, Dad, I've been with you for years slaving. Well, the dad has slaves, doesn't he? He has servants. So there's a bit of a contrast in this story that doesn't line up. And this older son's perception has been skewed because of the bitterness that's inside of him. Has that ever happened to you? Do you know anybody that's ever happened to? Darlene came up to me. She preaches in the 1103 service, and she said, I knew of a family who the son sued his mother for his inheritance before she passed. And it broke her heart. This bitterness that was inside. Sometimes we become the older brother, don't we? I mean, I've got a younger brother, and I can be that older brother. And sometimes we get that way in church. We've been talking about how we help people. And sometimes we get to be that older brother, which is not a good thing, because there's a place in us that keeps us from fully being alive. And Jesus says, I came that you might have life and have it to its full. We talked about that last week. There's a preacher, Wayne Cordera, that says this. If you don't hear anything else, and we're about to conclude, hear this. You can live in the Father's house. You can live in the Father's house and not have the Father's love in your heart, or not have the Father's heart in you. Number 3. The third reason we rejoice in God's radical welcome of prodigals is because we're all in this together. We've all been prodigals and we're kin, right? We're kin folks. We're all kin. When the older brother continues his outburst, He says, this son of yours, he tells the father, he squandered everything with prostitutes. And you've killed the fatted calf for him. He's resentful. And so let me ask you, as we conclude, when in the story does it ever mention prostitutes? Well, it doesn't. It's the perception of the older brother that's created this image. And he says, this son of yours, and the father corrects him. And he says, it's your brother too. We are a family of God, and God has called. You remember when Jim Osier was here and he taught us how to do the 5-10 link rule? I go to midweek dinner and I watch groups of people sit together because they have a relationship, and we're kin, and that's a great thing. I like to come to church because of the friends that we all have, that I have, that you have here. But Jim Osier said when somebody we don't know walks up and we don't recognize them, as the 5-10 link rule is that we stop with our conversation with our friends and we go to these strangers. We extend a hand, we get their name, we tell them our name, we connect them with somebody else, and we extend hospitality. When you make a commitment for Christ, like you're going to do this morning with your card, you're extending through the church, the ministry of Christ, to people like Brian Courtney, excuse me for picking on you, or Brian Howard, or Shonda Ayers, or some of the others who've shared, who have found a path, because people come here looking for life to its full. I invite you to